Today, we are going to return to regularly scheduled programming here on School of War, even though the war in the Middle East very much continues. We did the same thing following the onset of hostilities in Ukraine in the winter of 2022. And as we have with Ukraine, we'll return to the war in Israel from time to time, especially as major developments occur. As ever, we are less interested in current events. You've got lots of ways to get the news out there, as we are in discussions that help us understand what war is and how war works at every level, from the tactical up to the political, generally using history, though sometimes the headlines, as our guide. Today, we've got a discussion recorded before the start of hostilities in the Middle East on the development of night naval warfare, really a story of military organizations struggling to get innovation right. Let's go.
It is a prescription for war, this Iraqi invasion of Kuwait.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
The bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate.
We continue to face a grave situation in Iran.
The people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall never surrender.
For maps, videos, and images, follow us on Instagram, and also feel free to follow me on Twitter at Aaron B. McLean. Hi, I'm Aaron McLean. Thank you for joining School of War. Delighted to be joined today by Vincent O'Hara and Trent Hone. They are naval historians. Vince is the author most recently of Innovating Victory, Naval Technology in Three Wars. Trent is the author most recently of Mastering the Art of Command, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz and Victory in the Pacific. They are both the co-editors of a volume that we'll be discussing today, Fighting in the Dark, Naval Combat at Night, 1904 to 1944. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining the show.
Our pleasure. Thank you for asking us to be here.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
So I want to start really big picture here and sort of start before 1904, if you like. Because what you gentlemen are doing to this volume that you've edited, and I have to say it was genuinely fascinating. And for the purposes of School of War, for the show, this actually it occurs to me, the first episode we are recording that deals with naval combat. We've dealt with strategy in a naval context, Mahan, things like that. But this is the first time we're really talking about fighting at sea. And it's in a way, an unusual way to get into it, because we're going to zoom into this particular question of fighting at night and technological change in a particular period. But I think your book does a really interesting job of using this question of night combat at sea as a way of illustrating all of the broad and important trends of the evolution of combat at sea in the first part of the 20th century. And it obviously has, in at least a thematic way, applicability to today. So my first question for both of you is, if we go back before the period that night combat was common or even more common than not in naval warfare, characterize, if you will, what it meant to fight at sea prior to the age of technological sort of revolution that you're really focused on in this book. What did it mean to have, big fleets and battleships, and how did people think about war at sea, and then how do things start to change in the 19th century?
Okay, can I start with that, Trent? I think the one word characterization for how night combat played out at sea before some of the technological innovations we discussed is confusion. And if there was a battle at sea, odds are it was accidental. So you have something that's happening without plan, by accident, and you can see that it's a very, very, very problematical event. I think that what's important about our book, what's interesting about our book, is that we demonstrate how something which was unwanted became something desired. Because we talk about combat as being a tactical event, but actually combat drives strategy very often. And I think one of the things this book shows is how night combat changed naval strategy and brought a whole new area of concern to navies into very important play. So confusion is my one-word answer. Trent, do you want to expand?
Yeah, that's a good summary, Vince. We try to touch on this in the introduction and explain, as Vince just did, that it was undesirable or happenstance. I mean, obviously there are certain circumstances where it makes sense, and we can see examples of fire ships and other things being used in the age of sail to try to gain certain advantages at night. But it's just so difficult to bring any level of cohesion because the darkness adds an extra dimension onto what is already a very challenging environment to cooperate across ships, particularly if there's a substantial number of them trying to operate in a formation. And so what I think is really interesting about the book, as you alluded to, Aaron, is we talk about the introduction of these technologies and how the circumstances change and how night combat can move from something that is sort of foreign and undesirable to something that becomes, at least for certain navies, advantageous.
Yeah, we had to go all the way to the Venetians and the Ottomans to find examples where night combat actually had some sort of doctrine and deliberate intent. So it was a very uncommon thing to have happen.
In something like this, the Spanish Armada, the destruction of the Spanish Armada is sort of like what the exception that proves the rule, if you like.
Well, the fire ships, I think that was more of a circumstantial and fortunate for the British, at least, event rather than a planned or deliberate or something which was brought about by craft and art.
Maybe take a second, just if you would, maybe just briefly sketch out what happened there in case. I think listeners are probably generally aware that there was such a thing as the Spanish Armada and it didn't work. But what actually happened?
Well, the weather came in and drove the Spanish around the Isle of Britain, and a lot of them ended up on the rocks in Scotland and elsewhere. And I don't think it's a very good example of night combat. You had some fire ships involved, but that's we could have started with the Battle of Red Cliffs, I suppose, in the Han Dynasty, but. I don't consider that really an example of night combat. I consider that an example of the accidents of warfare, if you will.
So you cite this statistic in the book, and I'll sort of fudge the numbers here a bit, but something like 10% of naval warfare for the Royal Navy in the 18th century occurs at night. And then something like 80% of warfare for the United States Navy, World War II in the Pacific, occurs at night. And that sort of really throws into sharp relief your point that we are going from something that is accidental to something that is desirable. Broadly speaking, why does that happen? Why do we start to fight at night?
Okay, I'll give a couple one-word answers, and I'll let Trent expand upon that. I think the first reason is intention. You have to have the intention to do something before it can happen, and in order to have the intention, you have to have the need. So I think the perceived need is one thing which really drove the spread of night combat. You take an easy example like the Italians. The Italians did not want to fight at night, so they did not develop the tools or the techniques of the doctrine in order to do it. Other nations like Britain and Japan, which saw that with new technology like searchlights, they might have an advantage fighting at night. They cultivated that capability and ended up on the plus side of the equation when it came to actually night combat. Trent?
Yeah, I think to be precise, we're talking about like surface naval actions. I'm sure a lot of listeners will think, 80% U.S. Navy actions, and they're thinking of like big things like Midway, Coral Sea, Philippine Sea. Those aren't night actions, but we're talking about surface combat. And Vince is right. There are a number of different things that drive it. I think the technology is very important, but it also folds into strategy, or at least conceptually, how to be most effective with naval forces. Certainly in the Imperial Japanese Navy, they are seeking night combat. They're honing their skills in that regard, and they think it is a way to offset the numerical and production advantages that their main opponent, the United States, is expected to have in a war. So they're preparing for it. The British Royal Navy is thinking a little similarly in that, hey, the experience in Jutland in World War I, they did not, in their assessment after the fact, do as well as they might have at night. They sort of eschewed the idea of fighting at night. So, let's take that, what was a disadvantage, let's turn that into a potential advantage, especially if we are going to be forced to have a Navy of relatively limited size due to the arms limitation treaties that are in force in the interwar period, and yet have to fight potentially in multiple environments. The North Sea against a resurgent Germany, the Mediterranean against Italy, and in the Pacific, or at least the Indo-Pacific region, against potentially an empire of Japan. So here's a way, based on the distribution that we're going to have to have of our naval forces, to offset some of the numerical disadvantages that we might face. The other big factor, of course, is airplanes. As some of these nations get very effective, and as the range and striking power of airplanes increases, surface action becomes something that becomes more common at night, because you can hide from the airplanes, or at least not endure a strike of the same kind of size and intensity, at least, in the 1940s during World War II, when a lot of these actions are fought.
So it seems like the increasing frequency of naval combat at night has to do with this intersection of countries that are seeking for an asymmetric advantage, like France or Germany with respect to Britain, or Japan with respect to, Russia at first, but, the United States in the longer run. What are the technologies that start to make this possible? You folks talk about torpedoes at some length in the book. I mean, obviously, people were looking for asymmetric advantage long before this kind of thing, this fighting at night, was feasible. What are the things that actually start to make it feasible?
Yeah, torpedoes are one of the most important examples, but especially early in the 20th century, torpedoes are relatively slow and relatively short range. So you have to get close. And so that drives a preference for night attack, because a lot of the platforms that are carrying torpedoes, are these torpedo boats or these early destroyers that are small. And so they're very vulnerable. And if you can get close because you're under the cover of darkness with a platform like that, then you gain a greater chance of scoring a hit with these early torpedoes. So it drives that kind of tactic. That's very important. Radio is also extremely important, because now we have a means to begin to coordinate that doesn't rely on line of sight or visualizing. So signal flags aren't very visible at night. Some of the navies experiment with lights for signaling, sort of hanging off the back of a ship in the lead, but they're not very reliable, and they work at very, very short ranges. So radio is an enabler of this kind of approach. And then what it builds to, radar later in the 20th century is also instrumental to making this effective.
Trent, you're forgetting the most important thing: searchlights.
I was going to get there.
Oh no, you weren't.
I just thought I'd go from radio to radar, because they operate on similar technologies. But yes, searchlights are extremely important as well, because then if you are one of these potential targets of an approaching torpedo boat, you can illuminate the torpedo boat with searchlights, or you can illuminate an enemy battleship with searchlights.
It's a progress, because we start by saying that at night you're deaf, dumb, and blind. You can't see what's happening. Your audio range is very limited, and you have to hail people through a loudspeaker, through a horn. And so, first of all, it's the ability to communicate at night. And radio is very important in that, and that first comes in the Russo-Japanese War. But I think people are most secure in seeing. That's our primary sense. And I think the fact that searchlights, when they were first developed, were considered to be revolutionary. This was like electromagnetic technology that first hit before radio, before radar, before any of that, even before torpedoes, really. And so that gave you a way to aim your guns. It seems obvious to us today that if you turn on your light, people are going to see you. I see all these cop shows with the police holding their guns out and their flashlights right next to them. I think, wow, these guys are dead. And that's what happened with searchlights. You turn on your searchlights, you're a target. But people didn't realize that at first. You need experience in order to know that.
So you said earlier in our conversation that there's a way in which tactics can drive strategy. Obviously, strategy can have an effect on tactics, and there's this kind of interplay between the two. And a theme in your book is the way in which night warfare broadly, but the sort of whole evolution of technology and tactics that are a part of that, drives naval warfare in the direction of lighter forces being used towards decisive ends. I think I'm phrasing that in a way that's defensible, though you gentlemen are the expert, and I am an infantryman by background and trade, so this is all fairly alien to me. Though I do know to turn off my flashlight. That much we did cover. So just talk about that, and you have a sort of fascinating riff early in the book about Mahan and his embrace of decisive battle as a centerpiece of the way he thought about naval combat, and Corbett's modifications to that, and the Genecol's sort of take on asymmetry. Like there's a lot here, but what I'm trying to get at is, how does the evolution of this technology pull naval warfare into the direction of, for example, the destroyer, which I did not know. This was new for me in the book, because I know very little about surface combat, that the destroyer is actually something that comes out of this whole technological process.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. One of the things that we tried to do with that introduction, talking about Mahan, Corbett, the Jus Nicole, which is sort of a French theory of how best to deal with the British, who have a much larger and more dominant navy through commerce destruction, is to begin to put the naval theories of these different nations into context, and so look at the tactics or strategy or force structure as emerging from the context of each of these different nations, position them appropriately. This is something that Vince has been very good at throughout his career as a naval historian, is trying to position the work of different navies, not just in their historical context, but also in the context of the nation that they're emerging from. And what we're trying to do with that is say, there's no one type, there's no one size fits all here in terms of what is the approach to naval combat and what is best. It is contextually dependent. Now, getting to some of the evolution of these technologies and these tactics and so on, I alluded to torpedo boats and torpedo boat destroyers, which is what they were originally called, later shortened to destroyers. Earlier on, right? They are a vehicle for this new weapon system, the torpedo, which again has short range, isn't very fast, at least at first. But a torpedo boat can be really small. It can be relatively inexpensive. It is not too dissimilar, if we think about analogies, to the UAVs, or anyway the unmanned boats that the Ukrainians are using in their fight against the Russians.
If you can't afford an F-35, then buy a drone.
Yeah, in that they're small, they're relatively disposable, and they're quick to build. And now a torpedo is technologically sophisticated. The torpedo boats were technologically sophisticated as well. So there's skill that goes into producing them and to crewing them. But they're a way to counter some of these larger fleets. And that's some of the French perspective. It's like, we expect the British to blockade our ports. If we have a fleet of torpedo boats that they don't have to be very large, they just have to be able to reach this close blockade that the British are expected to impose upon us, damage enough of their battleships to force them to retreat, then we can take to sea with a fleet of relatively independent commerce raiding ships, large armored cruisers with range that can prowl the sea lanes, destroy British shipping, and try to provoke this sort of panic among British commerce. So not necessarily destroy all the British commerce to starve England, but enough of it to cause a financial panic, disrupt their system, and force them to think about coming to terms, forcing a peace that would be acceptable to us as France.
If I can expand upon that just a little bit, I think what's really interesting to me, at least in the process of putting this book together and researching the various aspects, is that every navy, every nation had its own unique set of needs, its own requirements, but also its own limitations. A country like Italy, for example, or France, even for that matter, cannot afford to take the German route of trying to outdo the Royal Navy by building battleships up the yin yang. They have to come up with some sort of different method for achieving, if not naval superiority, at least naval viability. They have to be able to dispute the seas, if nothing else. And so every nation brings something different to that equation. And that's one of the reasons why we didn't focus on the Japanese, for example, or on the British, but we tried to include people like the Russians, the Italians, and we tried to cover the spectrum of naval warfare throughout the first half of the 20th century in order to highlight the different ways that nations respond to these problems and the different problems that they have. One size, like Trent says, does not fit all. And for me, that's the true fascination in something like this. We're trying to deal with threats these days. The Iranians have much different skill set and capabilities than the Chinese do, but they're both threats at sea. And we have to deal with the different natures of those threats in order to be effective at sea. And I think this is like a hotbed. The early 20th century was just a breeding ground of ideas, of technologies, of methodologies that's really not all that well understood or even examined. And I think highlighting little dark corners of naval history, like surface combat at night, which to an infantry guy like you is pretty alien, I imagine, really brings out some interesting possibilities and at least discussion points.
Yeah, it was a decided shortage of discussion of crayons in the book for my usual tastes, but I did manage to take some things away from it.
Purple is the color.
Yeah. So, well, on this theme of different approaches, so this question will skip over the Russo-Japanese War, which I want to come back to, but just skipping from French thinking about how to one day fight Great Britain to the German reality of it in the First World War. Germans are also anticipating a blockade, right? But how does their thinking, because they're the ones who actually end up having to test themselves against the Brits, how does their thinking and preparation differ from French thinking? And then how does it, in broad terms, how does it actually go?
How do the French differ from the Germans? Let's think about that one.
Well, the Germans are also wedded to this idea that the British are going to impose a close blockade. There were legal reasons for this. There was some question as to whether a distant blockade could really be a blockade. It could be enforceable prior to World War I. And so a lot of the German planning is based around that idea that the British fleet will come in relatively close. That will give us an opportunity to sortie forth. We will seek battle. And, part of their thinking, evidently, was that we'll produce so much of a threat. We'll have a fleet sizable enough that if the British have to fight us in this way, they will be so crippled that they won't go to war. It becomes a deterrent mechanism. The risk fleet, so-called, that they strove to use, and destroyers are an important part of this, or at least torpedo boats. They were fairly precise in their definition of them. Often they're called destroyers in texts and other things, but Len Hines, who wrote that particular chapter, emphasizes, these are torpedo boats. These are relatively small ships, and they don't need terribly great range because, again, the assumption is that the British fleet will be relatively close, and so the battle is going to be fought somewhere in the North Sea in between the coasts of Germany and England. But it doesn't work out that way because the British imposed this more distant blockade. Their logic is, well, the North Sea has become too dangerous. There are too many lethal systems at play here: torpedoes, torpedo boats, submarines, mines, and so risking the modern battleships of the Grand Fleet in those waters is something that they don't want to do, at least not on a regular basis, not without a clear sense that there's going to be some kind of profit from it, like the potential to actually defeat the Germans in a battle at sea. And so the Germans struggle to really understand how best now, they're one of the key assumptions about how to fight a naval war is invalidated from the very beginning. And then a lot of the war is them sort of working through and adapting to that fact and trying to figure out how to alter their strategy effectively. And I like the way that Len's chapter touches on that.
And so the engagements at night that happen then there's sort of the final phase of the Battle of Jutland, right? Which carries on into the night. And then you have a lot of these sort of harassment or raiding actions in the Channel. Like, how does it actually play out?
Yeah. So the Germans do invest in larger and more powerful torpedo boats or torpedo boat destroyers that are going to be able to sortie forth more effectively. There is the battle, or the continuation of the Battle of Jutland. The British don't acquit themselves terribly well in that they have some close range encounters with German ships. They do manage to sink one of the old pre-dreadnought battleships of the Germans. But there is, as the fleets sort of cross paths, there was potential opportunity to at least be more aware of what the Germans were doing, and the communication, the messages didn't find their way to the key decision makers within the Grand Fleet. So there's a missed opportunity there, and the Germans proved themselves to be fairly adept at handling their ships at night, and they then capitalize on this, as you alluded to. They try to interdict coastal traffic or cross-channel traffic in the Channel later in the war. And there's a nice description of how they have some successes at this that, to my mind, really highlights some of the challenges that exist in this time frame, late in World War I, with making sense of what's going on in a night action. The British are often caught by surprise. They misidentify the German ships, mistake them, these enemy ships, for friendly ships, and sort of are hard pressed to respond effectively to the disruption that the Germans caused and the initiative that they're able to seize, because they're the ones invading, sort of not exactly enemy held because it's the sea, but the British feel fairly comfortable with what they've been able to establish there in the channel. And so they have to be a little bit more uncertain. Is this ship that is approaching, is that friendly or an enemy? And the Germans have divided their forces up in such a way that more or less consistently, if they encounter anyone, they can assume it's an enemy. And so they can start shooting first prior to making a
That's part of the
identification.
advantage that you have at fighting at night is that you can dictate the area where you're going to fight. You can dictate the forces involved. You can dictate the time involved. You can dictate all the variables or most of the variables, and hopefully by being in control of the variables, you can achieve a better outcome. And I think the Germans were experimenting in different ways of doing that. I mean, if you look at World War I, in the first half of the war, most of the night encounters were accidental. They were two groups of ships blundering into each other, and suddenly you have explosions of light and detonations and this, that, and the other, and then it's all over. And what happened? Who knows? And so the Germans were trying to put some sort of Teutonic method of control into the situation by some of these attacks that Trent was talking about, penetrating a line of British patrol ships and buoys and going through and shooting up merchantmen. But, when you look at it, ultimately, all this stuff really didn't have that much of an impact on the naval war. It was kind of like, we have these navies, we have to use them. What are we going to do? Oh, let's raid the British mine barriers. Maybe that can help some submarines get through, maybe not. But it's more of a question of, none of this is war-winning stuff, is what I'm trying to say.
Well, there's a theme that you touch on in the book, or that numerous authors in the book and your introductory material touches on, which is the way in which, as the pace of innovation picks up, and you have officers having to rely on theory as opposed to experience, you find yourself in these situations where there's some new technology, say torpedo and torpedo boats, for example, and it's so exciting and so interesting and so potentially game changing that the theory of the case becomes, well, it will be game changing. Like, this is going to change the face of naval, of surface combat forever. We're going to sneak up on these guys at night, or sink them, and game over. And of course, the reality, and we can talk about this with respect to World War I, or we can go back to the Russo-Japanese War. The reality is much messier and more complicated, and the pace of actual change and actual impact on the battlefield is slow. So if you talk a bit about that phenomenon and how it plays out, and then this is one of the things in your book that seems to me to be obviously relevant to the present day. We are still in a period of rapid technological change. We have new technologies that are being used here and there. You talk about using drones in a variety of creative respects in Ukraine, or before that in Azerbaijan and Armenia. So we're seeing stuff start to play out in limited scale, but we don't really know how all of these fancy new toys, you talk about the cyber realm as well, are going to work in a great power encounter of some kind. So it's obviously how to think about these things is important. Help us think about them.
Can I tell a little story?
Of course.
The first time a torpedo was ever used in combat was in 1868 or 69. It was off the coast of Peru. You had a Peruvian warship which was in revolt, and a British warship launched a torpedo at it. And some of the officers on the British ship were against the idea, because they say, "Oh, this is a very dreadful weapon to deploy." So they launched a torpedo. The Peruvian ship saw it, turned around, and outran it at 10 knots. The expectations that the British had about this weapon was much different than the reality of the weapon. You don't know what's going to happen if you deploy this weapon until you deploy it in warfare. And I think the same is true with a lot of the weapons that our ships are carrying today. It was certainly true in 1904 when the Japanese and Russians went to war. It was certainly true in 1914. And in 1914, they still didn't know, what torpedoes were really good for. It turns out they're really good for submarines, sinking unprotected merchant ships. That's what torpedoes are good for. But nobody knew that at the time. So yeah, it all has to do with use in warfare. That's one of the big points in the book that Len and I wrote about Innovating Victory, is that until it's used in war, you really don't know what this technology, what this weapon, what this platform is really good for and how it's going to perform. You might have a really good idea, but you have no certain knowledge.
Yeah, The wartime feedback loop is important, and we try to talk about that in various areas throughout the book. But also, there has to be, the technology doesn't sit alone. So with the torpedo, you need ships that can carry it, submarines, torpedo boats, sometimes, even battleships carry torpedoes. So there's that. And then there's also all the system that is around it. And in system here, I'm not just talking about like the fire control systems, but how does that Navy that now has that piece of technology change its operations or its command structures or its tactics to integrate that technology in a way that harnesses it, but also makes that technology effective and makes the ends that they're trying to achieve easier or allows them to accomplish those ends more effectively. So that the technology has to get integrated into this broader system. And that's one of the things that I think is very interesting about this period is you see different navies taking different approaches to create that system, that broader system that now brings, the people, their ships and their technologies together to accomplish the ends that they're set upon. And that's why the context is important, because the context defines those ends. But one of my favorite examples of this kind of thing is the introduction of the Combat Information Center. And I'm jumping ahead quite a bit, but to the U.S. chapter that I wrote, the United States Navy enters the World War II with radar. And a lot of people say, well, radar gives them eyes at night. And it does create an ability to probe the darkness and to get a sense of what may be out there. But what the Navy learns relatively quickly within the first year of war is without some system to process the information that radar provides and make sense of it, and then provide it in an actionable format to ship or formation commander, we can't take full advantage of it. It's just sort of happenstance. It's not reliable. So there's a whole new system to process information that wasn't available before because radar didn't exist before, that has to be created and integrated into the command function in order to take advantage of the technology.
Well, let's talk about the interwar period a bit then. The introduction of radar. You're talking about the American innovations in the war, but going back, there's a fair amount of emphasis in the book about Japanese innovation between the wars. And I mean, it's interesting. There's sort of the Japanese embrace of night warfare is a theme. They seem to be among the navies that you're citing more forward-leaning perhaps than the average in this regard. I was struck by, there was one detail in the description of Japanese interwar innovation that struck me as incredibly relevant, which is the way in which they're, essentially licensing, which is to say ripping off Western technology and then creating it at home, which of course is happening today in the context of the U.S.-China competition. This is the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Not just ripping it off, but making it better. I mean, nobody knew about oxygen torpedoes. The British tried to develop them, but they couldn't. The Japanese thought, oh, the British are doing this, let's do it. And they did it. So
fair enough. And indeed, World War II kicks off in the Pacific, and the Japanese actually have, tactically at least, a pretty good run at it for a year or so. The chapter in question makes a good case that it's not ultimately strategically successful, but nevertheless they are winning a lot at night. What is it that they are doing that allows them to do that?
Well, I'll take that. They're doing a lot of things. One of the things that I really like is there is the Russo-Japanese War chapter, but then there is also, this chapter on the Japanese that deals with their interwar period and early World War II period. And there's linkages between them. So the Imperial Japanese Navy has this lineage that they can trace themselves back of these aggressive torpedo tactics that they embrace basically meaning, get close to make sure that you can secure a hit, be relatively, daring. And they take that forward into the interwar period. Now, that mix is driven in some respects in the interwar period because there's the naval arms limitation treaties that are agreed to. The first of which, the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922. These impose upon Imperial Japan a navy that is smaller in size and power by what is the common measure of naval force at that period, battleships. So they have 3/5 of the size of what the British Royal Navy is allowed to have and what the United States Navy is allowed to have. And although fight against the United States Navy, for example, the U.S. fleet will have to sail across the Pacific and lose some strength along the way, by virtue of the calculations that the U.S. and Imperial Japanese navies were using, that the U.S. fleet would still be powerful enough to win a large, decisive clash of battle fleets. So the Japanese have to explore, well, how do we offset this? How do we offset this advantage that has been imposed by international agreement? And they look at technology and their tactics as a way to do that. And so rather than sort of allowing the U.S. fleet to sail across the Pacific and just, sort of attrit itself based on, maintenance difficulties or anything else, they think, well, no, we will take the fight to them. We will attrit it through a series of attacks. And we need to look at night combat in sort of a mix as part of one of multiple facets that they were going to employ here. One would be submarines, another would be long-range land-based naval aircraft. But, night combat is the one that often receives a lot of the visibility and attention. And so they explore how best to not only win a big action with very long-ranged and powerful torpedoes. This is the Type 93, the famous Long Lance, which has the range of battleship guns. So now in the interwar period, the Japanese are developing torpedoes which reach extremely far, but also to conduct increasingly sophisticated and complex night actions that would use heavy ships, sometimes even up to the converted battle cruisers, converted into fast battleships of the Congo class, to help penetrate an enemy formation, as to break up the light forces of the screen and allow destroyers led by light cruisers to penetrate that enemy formation and then attack battleships or others with torpedoes from closer range, which you need to be able to fire things at relatively close range, usually at night, to be able to hit it, these torpedoes anyway. But at those distances, these Japanese torpedoes are moving with such range or such speed that they will increase their chances of a hit and be more difficult to avoid. So it's looked at as a way to, offset an advantage that through, diplomatic and international agreement, the United States Navy and the British Royal Navy have secured. And if you look at the various things that the Japanese invested in to try to offset this advantage, they have a great deal of success.
Yeah, I'd like to expand upon that just a little bit. Everything Trent said is completely true, as it always is. But there was another aspect to that is that it was agreeable to the Japanese way of doing war. If you've ever seen the last scenes in Yojimbo, for example, where the samurai comes in and he's slashing away and he's killing his enemies left and right with his sudden, fast attacks, that's kind of how they envisioned naval warfare. And it's simplification, of course, but it was agreeable to their way of doing things. And the Italian way of doing things was different, or the German way of doing things was different. So they all brought their different experiences or different cultures to the equation, and they did things differently. And I think that's really important too. Is part of it is perceiving how your enemy is going to fight, and you usually don't learn that until you're actually fighting them. But and then dealing with those specific aspects of the problem, the way that the Americans did with CIC, Combat Information Centers, for example. So I think that's an important element too.
Vince, let's talk about the Italians for a minute then. So, I confess, I don't know a great deal about the modern Italian way of war. Though my father fought in the Italian campaign in World War II, though I think mostly against Germans. And for the most part, when I think about Italy in the war, I can't get out of my mind. Somewhere Dave Barry has a write-up he has an essay about the Second World War in which he characterizes the Italian invasion of France as proceeding. The Italian army's invasion proceeds relatively well until their truck breaks down. So that's sort of my starting point. I apologize to the great Italian naval and military tradition, the fact that is my starting point. But nevertheless, we've been talking a bit about Japan. Talk about Italy and its approach to night combat.
That's the famous joke. How does an Italian admiral review his fleet? You've heard that, haven't you?
No, tell me the punchline.
In a glass-bottom boat.
Oh, of course, yeah. I've heard that joke told in the Russians inspecting the Black Sea fleet at various points where things have gone well for the Ukrainians in the last year.
Yeah, the Italians had a completely different approach to warfare. It was very logical, very reasoned, very why risk our big ships if there's no military gain to be achieved, and that's very logical and it's really true. But there are times when you need to risk. There are times when you need to take chances. The Italian approach to night combat was that we don't want to have anything to do with it. There's nothing to be gained by it. We have no. It's very unlikely it's going to happen. Finding people at night is almost impossible. Why should we invest the time and effort to come up with systems of combat where it's not going to be relevant to our needs? And so that was their position in the 1930s. At the same time, the British were busily developing the ability to fight at night. And you saw the results in some very disastrous actions for the Italians. I think that we talk about the Duesenberg convoy action in the book, where you have an entire convoy wiped out by an inferior force of British cruisers and destroyers. And that was all due not to weapons, not to the number of guns you had, not to pre-planning, not even to ultra, because the British stumbled upon the convoy by accident as it happened. And so it's you fight with the battles you're prepared for. And if you're not prepared to fight at night, you get defeated very handily. And I think the Italians kind of woke up and go, oh my God, the British have radar. Well, the Germans have radar too. They never told us. Well, there you go. Be careful of your allies. So they tried to develop those skills as fast as they could in the middle of warfare. And there's a lesson to be learned there as well, is how do you develop a skill set during war? And frankly, they were pretty effective, but the only problem was the British were not standing still. And they were working on their radar, they were working on their combat information centers as well. And they were able to maintain the British, their relative superiority, even after all the improvements the Italians made, which are detailed in that book. So I think it has to do with if you're caught short-sighted as the Italians were, it's not that easy to make up the lost ground. I think that's one of the big lessons there as well. You can be smart, you can be creative, but you got to count on your enemy being the same way.
Something that Trent said, talking about the Japanese fighting in the Pacific and long-range torpedoes, just inspires me to ask kind of a dumb sort of micro question for which the answer is probably obvious, but it's not occurred to me, which is using long-range torpedoes. Long-range gunnery in the period makes sense to me because the shell's going pretty quickly through the air. So you're pretty confident you know where the target's going to be, where the shell hits. How on earth do you get a long-range torpedo to hit its target? It's too early for sort of wire guidance systems, right? Or just how does that work? How is any of this actually practical?
Oh yeah, it is far too early for wire guidance systems. Yeah. I mean, later in the war, you have torpedoes that have some acoustical homing capability. But
you had wire guided torpedoes in the 1860s, Trent.
Well, yes, but how effective are they?
They almost sank the ship that fired one.
Well, there you go. Not as we think of them today. Let me say that. Well, yeah. There's sort of two paradigms that the Japanese are thinking about torpedo combat in: night combat, relatively close range, penetrate the enemy screen, launch them at because torpedoes have different speed and range settings, right? So you can go very fast for a shorter distance, or you could go farther, but more slowly because you're burning the fuel at a slower rate. And so, if I remember right, the Long Lance has three of those settings, and the high speed, short range setting is what you would use typically in night combat, particularly from destroyers. But the Japanese are also thinking that after that night action, or sometime after, at a time of their choosing, once they have sufficiently crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet, they seem to assume the United States is going to do what they need to do in order to be destroyed. So there's a little bit of optimistic assumptions in their planning. But anyway, they believe there's going to be a night or a daylight action, long range naval gunfire. This is where the Yamato type battleship comes to the fore. But also there is going to be a possibility, because most likely the battle lines will be steaming either on parallel courses or potentially on opposite courses. Either way, maintaining a fairly steady course so that they can shoot accurately. And that circumstance is going to allow the Japanese to fire torpedoes at relatively long range, much farther than the U.S. ships would assume that they are in danger of being hit by torpedoes. And among the large cruisers that the Japanese have, they installed some very sophisticated torpedo fire control devices that would anticipate a potential turn of the target and try to, secure hits. In some way, they're at least comparable in terms of sophistication of their gunnery fire control devices, and in some ways even more sophisticated, these torpedo fire control systems.
Yeah.
So they've invested an awful lot in the system. So there's the engineering of the torpedo, there's these fire control systems, and then there is, okay, how does this fit tactically?
Yeah, but that's all based on theory, and it's all based upon pre-war expectations. If you look at the reality of the situation, the Japanese did manage to hit targets in excess of 20,000 yards with torpedoes, at least 2 times that I can think of, maybe 3. And the secret of the Japanese in achieving this kind of questionable accomplishment was to use hundreds and hundreds of torpedoes. In the case of Java Sea, they fire, I can't remember the exact number, 96 or 104 torpedoes from 20,000 yards. They achieve 1 hit. Now, that's more torpedoes than the Italians fired during the entire war.
Well, and I assume these are expensive systems,
Yes.
relatively speaking. So you shoot 100 of them,
Yes.
and you're gonna.
Yeah. The Japanese did not stint. If they had a weapon, they used it.
Yeah.
And you can't say that for every nation. So yeah,
Go
they
big or go home.
Yeah, really.
It applies to the Japanese war effort kind of across the board. With predictable consequences.
They get 1 hit for 100 torpedoes fired. Well, the Italians got 1 hit for 100 torpedoes fired too. But that was through the course of a war, not through the course of one action. So I think what Trent brings up is part of the value of this book is that people develop weapons, they develop procedures, they develop systems, they develop really complicated fire control systems in order to meet these theoretical needs. But once you get in combat, those theories kind of tend to fall apart, and it's just throwing stuff into the water, and hopefully you get something done.
I don't really know which national context in which to ask this question, but maybe it sort of applies across the board. But over the period that you are covering here, how did the demands of officership, naval officership, change? What are the new demands, and how do they stay the same? How is being in command at sea or in a position of responsibility at sea the same, in the Second World War as it was at the end of the 19th century?
There are some important changes, and you get an allusion to this in the chapter on the U.S. Navy. Also, the following chapter that Michael Whitby wrote on the fighting in the English Channel in World War II. The development of the Combat Information Center in the U.S. Navy and the Action Information Organization, the British equivalent in the Royal Navy, forces a different relationship between information processing and the command function. So essentially, these organizations offload interpretation of incoming information and its synthesis. And historically, that had been something that would commanding officers or formation commanders would do. Like, they expected to be able to do this. This is part of how they approach their role and their job. Certainly, they have staffs. Certainly, they have plots. They have other things, but there was an expectation that they would have the information available to them, and then in battle they make the decisions. And this becomes more of a shared or more of a distributed function. So they may be in a combat information center, but there is an evaluator within that center who is basically saying, look, this is what the information presents. If we take the assortment of radars available to us and other sources, this is the picture that you should base your decisions upon. So there's a shift in the relationship between commanders and this information. And those who are able to make the shift do a very good job. Arleigh Burke is a good example of that, and we put a quote of his in the conclusion about the difference between a good officer and a poor one being like 3 seconds, 10 seconds. Yeah,
whatever.
But that alludes to this fact that you don't spend time in what was then a modern World War II environment. You don't spend time questioning the information coming to you.
You have to rely upon expertise.
Yep.
Everything Trent says is very true, but you can be a navigation expert, you can be a gunnery expert, but you can't be an expert in everything simultaneously. And I think there's a greater need for naval officers, first of all, to recognize the fact that they can't know it all, and second of all, to be able to rely upon expertise. My example for that is the famous Admiral Cunningham in the Mediterranean, losing his first aircraft carrier to German bombers because he handled it inappropriately against the advice of his aviation experts. Because, God damn it, he's the admiral, he knows best. And you have to get away from that point, that mindset. And I think it was very difficult for some naval experts or officers to accomplish that.
There's also a shift that we allude to. This may have been somewhat less obvious, but I think it's important to state. Some of the navies are more focused on success in battle, victory in combat. And a lot of the actions that we describe have more of an implication on how how well is the Navy controlling or not the sea lanes? Basically, what you can do with the sea. How well are you controlling it? And I think some navies, some institutions were better prepared for that concept come World War II, and others not so much.
So, final question for you both. We've covered a lot of water, I would say. Actually, we've covered a lot of water here, and some of the lessons or some of the themes that we've been talking through are obviously applicable. You know, national specialization, making sure you understand how a particular fighting force is responding to technological change and how it might be different from others. These demands on leadership that you just talked about, a few others. You know, among what we've already talked about, what's most important, or are there things that we haven't mentioned that you think in 2023 is relevant? When you look back at the lessons of the period you're covering and the way in which navies responded to technological change and took to sea to fight at night, sort of in response to the advantages that new technology made possible, you know, what today should officers and leaders be thinking about when they think about dealing with technological change, sort of thematically?
I'll give a quick response. I'll let Trent give a reasoned and complete response. I think, first of all, everything you know is wrong. Take that as a given. Keep an open mind. Be prepared to accept new information, new ideas. I think complacency is the true enemy of success when it comes to sudden warfare. I think adaptability, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think so many good men died due to dear ideas that their commanders held. I think you have to be able to trash everything you know and be prepared to be adaptive and open to new ideas. I think that's the single most important thing.
I was going to say adaptability too, but Vince has covered that. So I'll expand on that a little bit. One of the things that in my writing about the U.S. Navy, I try to emphasize is there were feedback loops, and this happens in the war. So there's a capacity for adaptability that is built, and it starts prior to World War II, where the U.S. Navy and its officers are learning from exercises that are conducted on an annual basis, and they're gathering lessons from those. And so there's this habit of, we'll test something and we'll see what happens. And based on information, we can evolve. Now, the exercises are artificial. So some of the lessons that they learned before the war aren't right. They don't channel the appropriate kind of behavior for actual combat. But what that meant was there was this conditioning of, we will test something and we will see what happens and we will then learn. And so it's a fairly natural and rapid shift to a wartime situation where, okay, we're doing the same thing, but now the test is not an exercise. Now the test is, combat. We're going to go fight the Japanese off Guadalcanal at night. And, the lessons aren't always correct the first time around, but there's this pattern of learning quickly and then adapting tactics and technique from that. So there's an underlying assumption that we can get better, that what we have is wrong, we're not the best. And so we have to constantly be seeking out how to do this better, how to find new ways, how to better integrate the technologies.
As long as we tell ourselves the truth.
Yes.
And that's where a lot of nations really stumble. And I think that's one of the areas where the U.S. Navy proved to be superior to its opponents. In all humility, I say that.
I know I said that the last question was the last question, but you are compelling me to ask a follow-up. Vince, where are you most concerned that we, the United States, are not telling ourselves the truth right now?
I think we have this mindset where we are the best. And there's nothing wrong with that. But you always have to keep it in the back of your mind that you're not the best at all times in all situations. And I think you have to allow for the fact that, well, I'm not an expert in this. I speak much more confidently when it comes to the experiences of the past, but I have this uncomfortable feeling that there's a sense of complacency that will not serve us if the balloon does go up.
I'll modify that slightly. I don't think there is enough of a willingness to screw up. Like, to learn, you need to not get it right.
Yeah.
And I think we have created an environment, if we look at the U.S. military today, where there are expectations that once you are, an officer above a certain rank, you are not going to screw it up. And I don't think that's realistic. I think people will screw it up. Now, maybe they're not going to screw it up so much that lives are lost, at least not in a combat situation, but they are going to screw it up, and they need to be able to admit that they screwed it up. And their peers need to be able to say, yeah, you screwed that up. And they still then need, provided the screw up is not of large enough size, to have an avenue to continue to advance and learn from that experience, embrace what happened from that outcome and figure out what it means for changing their behavior going forward. And if you're not able to do that, then you aren't able to be honest with yourself, like Vince pointed out, and you're not able to do this kind of learning and adaptation that is required.
In World War II, before World War II, some very famous British naval officers screwed up and ran their ships aground or whatever, but they continued to serve, and they did very good service in the war. Every U.S. Navy officer I know who's touched ground loses command, for example.
Yeah, well, you end up, just based on my own observations, this is not a Navy-specific comment. I think I agree with your broad characterization of a lack of risk tolerance and a lack of, tolerance for mistakes as learning experiences. And so what you end up with is a senior officer corps or flag officer corps of folks who are good at not screwing up.
Yeah.
And on the one hand, okay, nobody wants to screw up. On the other hand, the person who's not good at screwing up is a particular kind of person.
Yes.
I'll take that one step further. If you look at the performance of navies in the first months of war, taking World War II as an example, you will see that a lot of officers in command were not in command 6 months later. Your risk-adverse guys, most navies do very poorly in the beginning of a war, and I think part of the reason is because of the risk aversion factor.
Yeah, well, and you end up, in the wars we've just fought in the Middle East, my own experience being in Afghanistan, where the stakes are not necessarily existential. You can actually end up in a situation where, where were the mistakes, if you like, in Afghanistan, deployment after deployment, but the battalions got there, they did their thing, they came back. You woke up in the morning, the Marine Corps was still there, the Army was still there, most of the planes were still there. So there, everything's proceeding without noticeable mistakes much of the time. And yet you get to the end of the exercise and you lost. You lost. It's been for naught. Well, in any event, gentlemen, this has been a fascinating conversation. Trent Hone, Vince O'Hara, co-editors and contributors to Fighting in the Dark, Naval Combat at Night, 1904 to 1944. I really appreciate you both taking the time and for giving us this volume to think about.
Thank you very much. It's enjoyable talking about these subjects. And so the pleasure has been all mine.
Yeah, thank you. Really appreciate it.